So thank you everyone for coming to this last Monday Majlis, which is on Wednesday, this one, of the term. And it's also the last visiting speaker event of the term. So it's a hybrid Majlis. And it is also the last Majlis I set up, and I will be on research leave from January, and it will be my dear colleague Sajjad Rizvi who will continue running the Majlises in the next term. I'll be back doing them in next autumn. And talking about dear colleagues, this was the first Majlis I set up for this academic year, because I knew it would be my last one, and I knew it would be our last event, or in general, last big event in the center, not just of the CSI, but the whole institute. So I wanted to do it with someone who is dear to me, a dear colleague who is a wonderful scholar and person. And yeah, I wanted to end up on a very, very high note. So I made sure this will happen. And yeah, well, technical difficulties aside, on the human side, I'm absolutely convinced we cannot go higher. So we will have Amira talking to us about her journey in academia, in life, whatever she will decide to share with us. And then she will guide us through her life and journey, and then she will guide us to the southern lights of Marrakesh. And so I think that's a very warm, delightful, and light, in the sense of full of light, celebration of the end of the term. So I thought that the easiest thing would be just to have, okay. Which place with Amira. You can sit here, and then.
Okay. Well, hello everyone in the room and online. I'm a little lower than I find ideal. I always like to stand when I talk because I move around a lot. But just for the screen, I'm going to try and sit here quietly and behave myself. I somehow hadn't got the memo about going through my life story before giving my talk. For a few minutes, I was a bit worried that you didn't actually want my talk and you just wanted my life story, and I was going to have to quickly think my way through what I wanted to say to you. But I do have some interesting insights, which I'm happy to start off with and share with you before we do take a trip down to Marrakesh. So I guess my starting point was just as a child who was a kind of closet Orientalist. For no particular reason, I was fascinated by Oriental scripts, designs, calligraphy, and I was quite into art. So actually it was the calligraphic which first drew me towards Arabic. And I was actually kind of toying with whether I should do an East Asian language like Chinese or Japanese, or focus on Arabic. I made a decision at some point that I was more likely to blend in the Middle East than in East Asia. And I was very shy as a young woman. So the idea of blending in and being able to creep around and not be noticed and not have people say, oh, you're a foreigner, was quite important to me. So in the end, I gravitated more towards Arabic than an East Asian language. But, you know, I am of that generation where a lot of people were the first in their families to go to university. So it wasn't assumed that I would. My dad was really keen that I should go to university. But if I had have suggested doing anything like Arabic, he'd have fallen off his seat in absolute shock and horror. So I applied to do something more conventional, history and history of art, because I was interested in calligraphy, art, those kind of things. I went up to Cambridge for interview. The tyre in my mum's car blew out. I was a nervous wreck. And the college I applied to rejected me and said, no way, you're not fit material for Cambridge University. But I didn't give up. I applied again the year after to a different college, and I had a much more successful interview. And I was actually admitted to the university. And I already had my A-levels by that time. So it was an unconditional offer. And I happily made my way up to Cambridge to read history. But I quickly found that the courses that really attracted my attention were the courses about places that weren't in Europe. I suffered bitterly through medieval British political history, medieval British social and economic history. You know, on reflection now, I learned some interesting things, but at the time, I wasn't enthralled. And so I was like searching through the curriculum to try and find courses which were more directed towards places that I was interested in. And one could only really at that time do it from a perspective of imperialism or colonizing other parts of the world. So my two options were the Expansion of Europe paper and the European colonialism paper. But I took those papers and I wrote essays on Palestine and on Spanish and Portuguese in various different parts of the globe. And at some point, I just thought, I wonder what these people would think about this. I wonder what they would say in their own languages. I wonder what they wrote about this in their own languages. I feel like I'm only getting half the story, which was the point where I decided to sort of circle round and change to Arabic from history. My directors of studies at Cambridge were fairly supportive of the move, although one slightly acerbic comment was, you just want to get out of doing history. I was like, well, no, not exactly. I'm just genuinely attracted to Arabic. So I changed to Arabic, but because I changed halfway through my program, I didn't have the opportunity to do a year abroad. And I really wanted to do the year abroad. So I got an internship with the American University in Cairo through some friends, and went and lived in Cairo for a year, which was a really transformative year for me. I worked with some of the best art historians at the American University of Cairo who knew a lot about the medieval city of Cairo, and they put me on a path that I've followed ever since, of like walking through urban space and looking at buildings, thinking how they relate to each other, thinking about what they look like in the past, what they look like in the present, thinking about the meaning of things like terms like Bain al-Qasrain or Asrain in the middle of Cairo. Oh, between the palaces. What were the palaces? Let's think about the palaces and go back in time and explore the city. So I trudged my way around Cairo. After that, I graduated, didn't really know what to do. Again, my family was like, you've lost this much money through spending 4 years at university when you would have been earning this kind of a salary. You shouldn't really carry on wasting your time and not earning. My mother's partner at the time actually totted up how much I'd lost by not working after O-levels, how much I lost by not working after A-levels, and then how much I lost by not working after my first degree. You just didn't really like the idea of the perpetual student or see the value of knowledge or learning or travel. And I was very much enjoying all of that, I have to say. So I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to go to the States. I went to Harvard to do my master's and continued with Arabic, continued with history, continued thinking about urbanism and material culture. But I then returned to the United Kingdom to do my PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. I guess I was just missing home by that point and thought I'd rather come back to the UK to do my PhD than stay in America. You know, felt like maybe I should reconnect with my family at that point, which I did by being based in London. So I'm a Londoner. So I started working on North Africa. I was going to write my PhD on Algeria. A civil war broke out. The archives disappeared. No one knew where they were. So having spent a year working on Abdel Qadir al-Jazairi, who was the head of the indigenous resistance to the French in the mid-19th century, I shifted to looking at the same period in Morocco. And that was a really important moment because it gave me a much more transnational perspective. So instead of thinking in terms of the history of Algeria or the history of Morocco, I was kind of like, what was going on in the Alawi Sultanate of Morocco at the time Abdel Qadir al-Jazairi was launching his resistance movement in Western Algeria? What were the connections? What were the communications? And that was an extremely rich theme of research, and it translated into a much better PhD than I would have done if I just worked on Abdel Qadir and just kind of been constrained by the borders of Algeria and not thought beyond them. So it pushed me to think in a different transnational way and showed the very deep connections across what later became the border between Morocco and Algeria. I then had the opportunity to do something completely different and almost didn't continue in academia at all. I got recruited by an Australian company to do cultural tourism, to take people around various destinations. I did cultural tour lecturing in Syria, in Egypt, in design tours, looking at the Sicilian Channel, so looking at Tunisia and Sicily, Morocco, the Iberian Peninsula. So I traveled a lot with groups, educating people in the history and the culture, but from the perspective of being in that space. And it's amazing how differently you think about things when you're actually in the space. You know, in my lecture, I'll talk about the Almoravids crossing the High Atlas. Oh, that's like quite a short phrase. You don't think much more of it. You think, oh, they crossed the High Atlas. Oh, great. Then you go and look at those mountains and you go over them on a bus and fear for your life. And you suddenly realize what an extraordinary achievement it was for camel nomads from the Sahara to walk across a mountain range with their animals, with their families. You know, the topography reveals things to you that you don't understand when you're reading a historical chronicle or secondary literature. So I found that really inspirational, and it kind of shifted my focus. I remained really interested in how regimes legitimize themselves, which had been kind of one of the foci of my PhD, but I became interested in thinking, how do rulers legitimize themselves in terms of building an urbanism and shaping urban environments? And so I began to read through lots and lots and lots of medieval Arabic chronicles to see how they describe cities in terms of what rulers founded, how those foundations were received, what chroniclers praised, what chroniclers criticized. So kind of a medieval version of what we all think about high-speed rail, for instance. So that just thinking about those kind of issues in a medieval context. So it's very, very interesting when you find criticism of infrastructural projects by chroniclers, because chroniclers are normally writing to praise a ruler. So if they actually slip some criticism in, then that project must have been really widely disliked. And there are a few examples of that which are quite funny. But, you know, it involves the same things that we see today, you know, requisitioning of property, demolition of people's homes, reshaping of urban environments. And it all comes across as, oh, so-and-so built this fabulous mosque and it was wonderful and such a benefit for the community. And then you stop and you think, how many people's homes were smashed? How many people lost a great deal in the construction of this new sort of power building, this prestige project? So that's what I've really been working on ever since, and what sort of underpins some of what I'm saying today in the book that it relates to. But, you know, when I started doing cultural tourism, I was offered a full-time job. And if the Cambridge, I was called by Cambridge, actually, as I was about to sign on the dotted line and move to Australia and become a cultural tour lecturer for the rest of my life. And Cambridge called and said, "Are you applying for the job we advertised?" And I was so embarrassed that I hadn't applied for it, that I said, "Oh, I've been abroad. I'm really sorry, but I'm happy." I'm happy to send in an application, but I thought it was too late. I mean, it was true, I have been traveling, but, and they said, "That's fine, it's fine, just send your CV and a cover letter." So I did, and then I went to the interviews. And I think many of us find in life that when we're relaxed and comfortable and something we're not desperately keen to have something, we perform so much better. So the irony of that whole interview was I was very relaxed because I thought I might well be off to Australia to have a completely different life. And I had that opportunity and I was very interested in it. So I didn't mind too much whether Cambridge offered me the job or not. So I was very relaxed. And, you know, they asked me some pressing questions at interview, but I didn't really mind. I was just comfortable to respond. And then I was offered the job. And then I realized that I'd really, I not exactly walked myself into a corner, but I think, you know, I think we all know that there aren't that many academic jobs available. And even in the late 90s, early 2000s, there weren't that many jobs available. And it's a small circuit. And if you sort of map around and you get offered a job and then you just say, "No, thank you," people quickly know you're one of they begin to see you as potentially just someone who's playing, not serious. So I thought, oh, now I don't know what to do. Should I take the academic job or should I become a tour lecturer? And I decided I wanted the academic job. I decided that was where my heart really lay, what I really wanted to do, and that probably taking groups around the same places year in, year out would wear a bit thin quite quickly. So yeah, I accepted. I went to Cambridge and well, as I say, the rest is history and is very evidently available information on the faculty website. So, but I have never regretted that decision. And I was very pleased to be made the offer. And it has enabled me, you know, it's a career that has enabled me to continue traveling to the places I love, to continue thinking about urban environments and engaging with them. And when I get time, I still take cultural tours because I think it's good to keep your knowledge of places fresh and continuing to experience them as real places in the world, not just as textual descriptions. So I guess that's me.
Well, thank you very much, Amira. I'm so grateful, and it's quite impressive. She didn't know that she should give this talk until like 10 minutes before we started. So yeah, I think you must be an amazing cultural guide as well, because there also you have to come up and in lecturing you have to come up with some solutions on the spot. But yeah, what I really would like just to underline that there is a life outside of academia, and knowing that there is a life outside academia helps a lot to deal with the pressure of academia. So yeah, there is this lesson of Amira applying again for Cambridge, not giving up on the one hand, and on the other hand is not being overly stressed about having a job in Cambridge or not. And this should help a lot of us in many situations, because if the only thing, that's the only option, that becomes suffocating. Academia can become suffocating, of course. Okay, so now let's go follow our guide to Marrakesh, please. Okay, I will share the.
So confused.
Please, if you can sit back, and I will share.
Be sure where I put my talk.
I share it. other screen with you, and okay, so here is the same.
Where would you like me to sit?
Where you were.
Where I was.
Yeah.
I'm quite sad. I can't just wander around and wave, but
Cool.
just if we start from the beginning for the slideshow, no, from the
Okay.
I should just
Good. That's yeah. This. Okay. Sorry, we need to get back to the beginning. Yeah. Can you hear us now?
Okay, we see a yes. That's good. Great. Thank you. Apologies for that. So I was saying that the title of this talk draws on an article I wrote many years ago in a book on cities in the pre-modern Islamic world. But obviously we continue, we think, we work on things, and I've modified some of my views. I've read other people's work. I think about things a bit differently. And what I'm presenting here is really 2 chapters from a book that I should be sending to the publisher soon, called The Medieval Maghreb, Cities, Patronage and Power. And I guess part of the concept behind this research is to locate actions on the urban environment in a number of different contexts. I mean, obviously, the idea of the Islamic city has been widely debunked, so I'm not going to go into that at this point. But it's interesting to think, how do we think about cities in the Muslim world and the things that rulers do, and the fact that how those things are narrated in Arabic chronicles that are often quite stereotypical. So we can say there isn't an Islamic city, but there is perhaps what one can call an Islamic urban imaginary, which is what I guess I'm interested in. But it's not necessarily the same in all parts of the Islamic world. So I work on the Maghreb, so I like to bring the Maghreb back into the conversation of the Islamic world and not let it be too Mashriq dominated. But I'm also, in the case of Marrakesh and other cities that I look at, keen to think about how dynasties may modify urban environments to express their particular dynastic sense of identity. You know, do all rulers do the same? And even if things are described in quite a stereotypical manner, are they actually doing quite different things? Are they completely changing cities, even though the narration of the events might look quite similar? So those are some of the underpinnings behind this talk. I mean, I should say, just as a kind of a fairly obvious point, I look really at capital cities in the case of this book. And of course, I'm totally aware that cities develop organically, that there are lots of socioeconomic factors that go into how cities develop, the communities that inhabit them. I'm not dealing directly with that in this paper, but I'm fully aware it exists. But like all of us, I can't do everything. So I'm focusing on one dimension, and it's not exclusive of all other dimensions. It's just one strand. So Marrakesh is particularly interesting, and it's my focus because it's founded quite late. It is actually founded in 1070. So it's quite a nice test case to look at how it evolves over the first 2 centuries of its existence. But since everyone isn't familiar with the Maghreb, I thought I'd just give you a quick, maybe not, a quick tour through things. We can move slides on. Yes, perfect. So just
those online, can you see Amira talking or just the slides? I wonder.
I think just the slides is fine, really.
Okay.
Anyway.
Good. Okay. I can see you. That's good.
That's fine.
Thank you.
So this is sort of the 1st century, if you like, 1st century CE, 1st century AH, 7th century CE. This is very schematic. It's not particularly accurate. It's just to give you the sense of where Muslims settled first, and the fact that the initial, we call it a conquest, but it's not like a thoroughgoing conquest of every little bit of North African territory. It's basically a little strung out set of garrisons, several on the coast, which had previously been Byzantine ports. So you can see it's really quite a broad, just a few little places in the 1st century. And the first big foundation is in fact Kairouan, in what's now modern Tunisia, which is termed a miṣr. Anyone who knows about the early Islamic period will know that the first cities founded by Muslims for Muslims were called Amsar, miṣr, from which we get the name of Egypt, miṣr. And we tend to translate it as a garrison town. The word miṣr went on to mean a provincial capital in some areas later on, but I'm going to take it as this sort of a town founded by Muslims for Muslims is a miṣr, or the Amsar. And Kairouan is the first one. It's a late example of a miṣr, 670s, but it's an important site. And it's only really in the next century that you begin to see more towns founded in North Africa as the urban centers of these regimes, which you can see on the slide. And it's sort of, I think when we talk about the Abbasid Caliphate, we often forget that they really controlled none of the West. They did control that sort of bit of Tunisia that's not in my Ibadi Rustamid Imamate circle. Those are the Aghlabids of Ifriqiya, who were Abbasid governors of a slightly nominal type. But the rest of North Africa is independent, and these are mostly Kharijite regimes. I mean, obviously they didn't necessarily call themselves Kharijite. The Rustamids were Ibadis. The Midrarids who founded Sidr al-Mafa were Sufris. The Idrisids were Zaydi Shia. And then on the edge, on the coast, the blue ellipse, we have the Bagawata. Now, the Bagawata are really very interesting because they've gone down in all the annals of the period and later as being heretics or heterodox. And one of the things I argue in my book, which is a bit speculative and possibly controversial, is one of the reasons they go down as being less Muslim than these other groups who maintained a lot of quite interesting practices that are not conventionally seen as orthodox. One of the reasons the Bagawata don't really gain the same status is because they have no central place. They have no city. And of course, one of the things you have if you have a town is you begin to have scholars. And what is one of the things that scholars do? They write your history. They write your books of fiqh. They write, basically, and they begin to create a narrative of that particular entity, whether it's the Rustamid Imamate, the Idrisid Imamate. And there are chronicles which talk about all these other dynasties and support the idea that they are Islamic dynasties. The Bagwata don't have this. They're tribes who live on the Atlantic plains of Morocco who insisted that they were Muslim, but they go down in the sources as not really being quite Muslim. Partly, I would argue, because they don't have that scholarly class, because they don't have a city. You could disagree with me on that point, but I think it's an interesting thing to reflect on. Trying to press the right button. By the 10th century, we see something rather different happening. We see most of North Africa being incorporated into much bigger imperial configurations. The Ismaili Shia Fatimid Empire. And again, with the Fatimids, we tend to think of, oh, they were in Tunisia and they went to Egypt and into a bit of Syria. They actually spent most of the 10th century trying to expand west as well. They had propagandists in the Iberian Peninsula all the way across the Maghreb. This is just schematic. It's not giving you an accurate border, but I just wanted to give that sense of how their influence pushed really far west. And the Umayyads expanded very much out of the Iberian Peninsula in this period and southwards. And this really enabled actually quite a lot of urban expansion and quite a lot of local tribal chiefs to become founders of small towns and to base themselves, at least occasionally, in small towns like Fez, and perhaps one of the most, the Zirids of the central Maghreb. They founded Ashir and a number of other towns which begin to urbanize the interior, but they're doing it under the imperial umbrella of either the Fatimids or the Umayyads, and their ideas are becoming much more sort of normatively Islamic, drawing on Eastern tropes in interesting ways, which we shall reflect on a bit more when we get to Marrakesh. And one thing I would just say, during this whole period, you do see a complete reorientation of the urban imaginary of North Africa. Before the Islamic conquest, people looked to Constantinople, maybe Rome. You know, if they had to imagine a big city somewhere, it was Northern Mediterranean Christian cities. What happens at this period, if the Rustamids are writing a chronicle about their foundation of Tahat, where do they draw their models? Where do they want to start a conversation with? Oh, Damascus, Baghdad, Basra, Kufa. Those places become the points of reference for people in North Africa as they found and develop cities. Like there are some similarities in the foundation myth of Kairouan with Kufa and Basra, in fact. And Tahat is called Basra of the Maghreb. Sijil Masa is compared to Kufa. Oh, it has tall buildings like Kufa. So there are all the references that are made about what are perhaps probably really quite small towns in North Africa. All the imaginary reference points start to be in the Central Islamic lands. And people do travel backwards and forwards. So although these are sort of imaginary in one level, they also reflect real connections. We know people from Basra in Iraq traveled to Tahat because Ibadis was strongly represented in Basra. So Ibadis traveled to Tahat, the capital of an Ibadi imamate. So there are real connections as well as these more imaginary links. So that sort of sets the scene. But now I'd like to move on to the rise of the Almoravids and Almoravidun. You know, 10 o'clock last night, I was happily putting my diacritics in, forgot to transfer the amended PowerPoint onto my memory stick. So if you're looking at that and thinking, oh, there should be a dot under that T, or there should be a macron over that U, I know, and I'm sorry. I didn't manage. I just made a little error late at night and didn't get the right PowerPoint on. Anyway, this gives you some background into Almoravidun. These are tribes. Anthropologists think that the modern day Tuareg of the desert, sometimes called the Blue Men, are the descendants of these Sanhaja tribes. They're a particular group of tribes living in the Sahara Desert. They're camel nomads. And in the early 11th century, they seem to be interacting with what are called locally ribāṭs, which seem to be small teaching centers located on the peripheries of majority Muslim territory. So there's one in the Souss Valley, southern Morocco, and this ribāṭ had an important teacher, Waggag, who was, and the word Waggag in the local language meant scholar, which is interesting. So, so we don't really know very much about what happened in these ribāṭs, but they tended to attract small groups of disciples. Obviously, in some places, a ribāṭ might be a more militant place where there's religious education, study, aesthetic practice, but also military defense of the frontier. We don't have much sense that the ribāṭs of what's now southern Morocco were used as military defense points. They seem to be more teaching centers. I mean, obviously it's difficult to know, but the information we have talks much more about teaching when you get back down to the deep south. So around the middle of the 11th century, we see a preacher called Ibn Yasin interacting with the Sanhaja tribal chiefs and organizing different sets of tribes into this militant Sunni Maliki movement. Now, Ibn Yasin is said to have studied in Cordoba, but it actually is more likely that scholars from Kairouan, where the Maliki school had embedded itself, were probably more relevant to the development of the Almoravid movement, and the idea of the connection with Cordoba sort of came later after they conquered the Iberian peninsula, because there were some very important Kairouani scholars involved, including someone called Al-Muradi, and also their myths of origin have a chief going on pilgrimage to Kairouan and meeting with the important scholar Abu Imran al-Fasi. We don't really know why they eventually became called Almoravidun. Was it because they were attached to a ribāṭ in the south of Morocco, or founded one of their own, or Ibn Yasin may have founded one of his own? Or is it a more general meaning of the word ribāṭ in the sense of girding oneself for jihad and for defense of the faith? And we don't know. Scholars have gone backwards and forwards, including chroniclers closer to the period. Either case, they did mobilize militarily. They captured the southern Saharan town of Al-Durust, and then the northern Saharan town of Sijil Masa in the Wad Dara, the Wadzis of Morocco. And here we can see certain economic incentives. The Sanhaja tribes wanted to control the desert trade, which was developing at that time, particularly, as you can see on the slide, a trade in salt and gold. And they had access to the salt mines in the desert, and they could swap it for gold being produced or extracted in West Africa. And it's not incidental that later on, the currency of the entire Mediterranean in subsequent centuries was based on the Almoravid dinar. The Almorabito is the Almoravid dinar, and it became a Mediterranean currency because it was, a good gold standard for everyone to use around the Mediterranean. So they had good access to gold once they had established control over Aldagust and Sidr al-Masr. And it's at that point that they begin to push north across the High Atlas to a place called Agmat. This is the general environment of Agmat. I put these pictures in so you don't get, tired of the talk and you have something nice to look at as we go along. So that's the north side of the High Atlas Mountains, the general region of Agmat, and those are actually the archaeological remains of the 11th century city of Agmat. There's been a big American-Moroccan project running there, led by someone called Ronald Messier, who has done a lot of work on this site. And it was a sizable town at the time. It was basically the Northern Atlas trade entrepot. So it was the main town in the region. The Almoravids stayed there for about 10 years. And then the question then arises, well, why did they choose to build another town? It may have been a commitment to expanding their empire to the north. Sources talk about the tribal chiefs of Agmat coming to them and sort of, that this is like, the Baghdad to Samarra move, your troops are a bit disruptive, it's a bit overcrowded, we'd really rather you moved out of this town, if you don't mind. So there's also that sort of narrative around lack of space, the different tribal groups, and the importance of moving the Sanhaja out of Agmat. So that is what sort of sets us up for the foundation of Marrakesh, which was founded by the first leader of the movement, Abu Bakr ibn Umar, and his cousin, Yusuf bin Tashfin. Now, the chronicles give a vast array of different dates for the foundation of Marrakesh. So secondary scholarship might tell you all manner of things from about 672 to 680 or so. So that there is a kind of a 10-year dating problem with the early part of the Almoravid Empire, where sources shift around quite a lot. So what interests me about the foundation of this city, is how do we understand it? Is it a ribāṭ? Is it inspired by earlier Almoravid foundations and the ribāṭs that were part of the southern landscape? Or is it also in some ways a late miṣr, a kind of a return to an archaic form? Now, the Almoravids were not entirely unurbanized, but they were primarily, as I've said, nomadic. However, there is in the sources an interesting reference to a site which the Mauritanians call their first capital. And this is the extract from al-Bakri, who is a very near contemporary writer. He's writing in the 1060s, so very close in time to this. And he says, Abdullah ibn Yasin ordered the Emir Yahya, who was actually Abu Bakr's brother, to fortify the Lamtuna Mountains, a towering range with plenty of water and food throughout. 6 days' travel in length and 1 day's travel in width. There was already a fortress, Husn, there called Azuki, surrounded by about 20,000 palms, built by Yano ibn Umar al-Hajj, Yahya's brother. So Azuki is sometimes considered the first Saharan foundation, and I kind of put this image up. This is entirely anachronistic, but this is a modern day, what they call a kasbah or qasbah of the Moroccan south, and it's the traditional type of building when you have earth to build with, and it's likely that early Almoravid buildings would have looked, broadly speaking, similar to these much later qasbahs. None of which, of course, remain because it is a very biodegradable form of building. It's very environmental, but it does mean that you can't look at a building 1,000 years old. It will have melted back into the landscape. So the best we could do are these kind of images. And what these two men built in Marrakesh, you can sort of see a plan on the left. Now, there's two green circles. The one on the left-hand, slightly lower side, is where the Almoravids built their fortress. a fortress that was called the Qasr al-Hajar, or the stone fortress, because it was, according to chronicles, the only building of stone in the entire city. So everything else is mud, rammed earth, mud brick, apart from the Qasr al-Hajar. It's not an entirely imaginative thing to call it, but it's descriptive. It tells us it was made of stone. So that was in the lower green circle that you can see there, whereas the first mosque was probably located much more in the center of the square city, or square-ish city, where the other green circle is located. Now, this geocentric design is quite unusual if you're looking at the plan of a miṣr, an early Islamic foundation, where you would expect and often find the Great Mosque rather close to the ruler's residence, where you have what's called a Dar al-Imara and mosque configuration, where you'd expect the Great Mosque and that seat of government to be fairly close to each other. So this geocentric plan is really quite original and different, and created this space where the Almoravids could move backwards and forwards very freely. But there are some other things I'd like to think about in terms of the accounts of Marrakesh's foundation, which link to tropes in urban foundation more widely. So first of all, you can see in the first extract, there's this emphasis on wilderness. And we find this in a lot of urban foundation myths. You transform wilderness into civilized Islamic space in the form of the city. And we have here, you know, we've searched for a desert place for you with no fauna apart from gazelles and ostriches, and no plants growing except for thorn and colocynth, which is the kind of shrubby thing that grows along the ground. So there's a transformation taking place there. I mean, we know that the plain on which Marrakesh was built actually has quite a nice little river called the Tensift, and it's fed by waters from the High Atlas. So it's not quite as described here. I mean, it was arid and underdeveloped. There was no town there, but the point of the stress on the characteristics of the space, you know, links into how you write about the foundation of a city and how you note this transformation from a wilderness. The second thing I just want to point out to you is that in the second part of this passage, and I've underlined the things that I particularly wish to draw your eye to. Okay, you have the Qasr al-Hajar being built, but there's a reference to without an outer wall. And that's quite important. And you'll find that actually, although I haven't underlined it in the third extract about Yusuf bin Tashfin, he didn't build a wall around it. So there's quite a stress here on the fact it wasn't a walled city. In fact, Marrakesh only had walls from around the late 1120s, when Ibn Rushd al-Jad from Cordoba recommended that the Almoravids wall their city because they were under attack from the tribes of the High Atlas Mountains who succeeded the Almohad movement. So these things can all be seen really as Islamic tropes in Marrakesh's foundation myths. So I've mentioned all these things, but just to sort of recap, the move from Agmat being prompted by overcrowding. This is a quite recurrent trope, that you build a new city because the previous one was overcrowded, or you build a new mosque because the previous one was overcrowded. This notion of transforming wilderness to civilization, with the understanding you mean something Islamic and urban, that it's unwalled. And there are some descriptions of towns in more polemical texts. Somebody called, a scholar called, I forget her first name, but her surname's Calasso, has written a really interesting article about this idea of cities protected by their ulama, and ulama forming a kind of a religious wall that protects the city in the same way that a physical wall might protect. Also, this notion of simplicity, and this actually links up with the final point on this slide, the idea of the ruler as a humble participant in the labour of building. You would have seen in the, you might have picked that up, the last one, Yusuf bin Tashfin, when God's mercy upon him initiated the construction of the mosque, he got involved with making the bricks and building alongside the labourers. And this is another common trope of the ruler physically being involved in building. But one can now argue that these are actually counter narratives to some of the narratives around, say, the foundation of places that were more luxurious, like Baghdad, like Medinat al-Salam and Baghdad often appears in the foundation myths of North Africa, not as something positive, but as something unacceptably luxurious. So these narratives of simplicity and humbleness, and we use brick, our leader is making bricks with us, is actually about that kind of egalitarian, pristine approach, not that approach of caliphs who treat everyone as their slaves and build elaborate, splendid palaces. That being said, Marrakesh did become splendid quite quickly under Yusuf bin Tashfin's son, Ali. And it's Ali who expanded the Qasr al-Hajr fortress into a palace. He also did a lot of hydraulic engineering, improving the transport of water from the mountains. And he began the process of founding garden estates outside the city as well. And he also built the first monumental mosque in Marrakesh. And we find in, Eastern reports of city foundations, if you read them closely, that particularly for the early Amsar, a monumental great mosque is not actually built when a city is founded. A space for prayer is delineated. There is a musalla from the outset, but that can be a very simple space. It might be delineated by a stockade. It might be delineated by a line of ashes, like I get that from Robert Hillenbrand's book on architecture. And the initial mosque in Marrakesh was not grand, as far as we know. It's just this brick building. Ali is the one who builds the monumental great mosque. And that is the second stage. The Great Mosque of Damascus was not built in the first stage. It's a second stage mosque. The same would apply to the Great Mosque of Cordoba, and here the Masjid al-Siqaya. And the Masjid al-Siqaya had this ablutions area, and I've just got a few slides to show you quickly, to show you sort of the splendor as far as we can ascertain it, but also the way that this shows a much more imperial moment. The Almoravids control West Africa, they control parts of the Iberian Peninsula, they've expanded across towards Algiers, and they're bringing in people from all those spaces to enhance their city through their craftsmanship. So this shows you, the red circle shows you where this little ablutions pavilion, the Qubba, is located today, and you can see there's quite a large mosque just above it. That's the modern Ibn Yusuf Mosque, but it was built on the site of the Almoravid Masjid al-Thaqaya, which had slightly different proportions. And since the mosque doesn't exist, all I can do is point you to some other Almoravid buildings to give you a sense. This is the punch stucco dome over the mihrab in the Great Mosque of Tlemcen, and the other two images are from Algiers, to give you a sense of the style and grandeur. And these are a few more slides of the Qubba itself. I particularly just wanted to point out how beautifully decorated the interior of the dome was. And from an art historical perspective, it seems to be in conversation with the domes in the Umayyad Great Mosque of Cordoba. It's not actually structurally the same, but it's clearly in a conversation with the Great Mosque of Cordoba, which, you know, connects us to Almoravid beliefs. They may have come from the Sahara, but they were Malikis, like the Umayyads of Cordoba. They very much supported the Maliki juridical class. They were very deferential to them. So there was no ideological disjuncture between the Iberian Peninsula and the Almoravid regime. So it was a very blended situation. We don't have much time now, but I want to whiz on to the rise of the Almohads and how they reshaped the city, because I think that's it's quite interesting to see how cities change in real time. We have the Almoravid minbar here. This is like a really interesting minbar. It was made in Cordoba for the Masjid al-Saqaya, but it was then placed in the Almohad Great Mosque. So this is like a crossover structure which bridges the gap between these two dynasties. Mainly, I would say, because it's a very splendid piece of construction, and both dynasties in their own way wanted to refer to the Umayyad Cordoban heritage. So it was valuable for the Almohads as well as for the Almoravids. So they saved it. But in many other ways, Marrakesh was entirely reshaped. Just to give you a quick glimpse into who the Almohads or Almoravidun were, in contrast to the Almoravid movement, which was backed primarily by the Sanhaja of the desert, the Almohad movement was backed primarily by Masmuda tribes from the High Atlas Mountains and the Sus Valley below that. Muhammad ibn Tumart came from the Sus. He was a Masmuda Berber himself, educated in Cordoba and possibly in the Islamic East, although that's a very, very debated point. But the most important thing is he was a radical preacher. He seems to have been inspired to a certain extent by what was at that time very new Ghazalian interpretation of the faith. The idea that you blend exoteric rites and law with a more esoteric faith and spirituality, that Muslims have personal responsibility, and that hisba isn't, you know, commanding good and prohibiting wrong isn't just for jurists, but should be a more communal endeavor, and that one should look at the sources, not just a commentary literature, that you must look at the usul ad-din, the original scriptures. So that was, broadly speaking, Ibn Tumart's position, but unlike al-Ghazali, he saw himself as the guide rather than the Quran as the ultimate guide, and he was recognized by his followers as the Mahdi, and began to mobilize the Masmuda tribes against the Almoravids, whom he criticized very harshly, mainly for their reliance on Maliki juridical opinion, rather than being more kind of sophisticated in their religious approach. Ibn Tumart died around 1130, and the construction of an empire was actually carried out by his successor, or Khalifa, Abd al-Mu'min. And you can see on the slide sort of the sequence here of major cities falling rapidly in the second half of the 1140s, culminating with Marrakesh in 1147, and then subsequently Abd al-Mu'min expanded the empire all the way across to the coast of Tunisia, what's now Mahdiya, and pushed into the Iberian Peninsula. So it became a very, very large empire, but of a somewhat different shape to the Almoravid Empire, because they didn't control the deep south, they didn't control the gold. So actually, if you look at minting patterns, you'll find that the amount of gold minted under the Almohads was much lower than the amount of gold minted by the Almoravids, and its silver currency which takes over because they did have access to silver mines. But they're faced with a really huge problem when they get to Marrakesh. It's a suitable place for them to have as a capital. It's the established capital, but it's very closely associated with the Almoravids who founded it. And so they have to reconfigure it. And one point I failed to make as we whizzed through the Almoravids was this idea that the name of Marrakesh actually comes from Sanhaja words meaning the domain of God, Amur Yakush. So the Almoravids actually sort of called their city their domain of God. So this presents the Almohads with a challenge. How do they make Marrakesh their domain of God, not the Almoravids' domain of God? So we find a different city emerging as a result, and some very polemical stances being taken on the slide. I say Abd al-Mu'min himself conquered the city in 1147, but he wouldn't enter it. He refused to go into it because he argued that Almoravid mosques were deviant, that Qibla was wrong. And obviously that reference to the Qibla was also signaling that he saw the Almoravids themselves as deviant. That the Qibla becomes the symbol of that, and he wouldn't go into the city until mosques had been reoriented. We have no idea whether they were or not. He suggested that the Almoravid Qibla was rather Jewish, and if you're interested in that point, you can ask me in a question afterwards. So he occupied the Qasr al-Hajjah. The Mu'minid caliphs lived in the Qasr al-Hajjah from 1147 till around 1189. So they didn't mind the palace. That was fine. It's a secular space. It was fine. They occupied the palace, but they reshaped the religious geography or topography of the town completely. They shut down the Masjid al-Saqaya, this new, beautiful building, locked up. They grabbed its minbar. You saw the beautiful minbar a few slides ago. They transported it across town to their new mosque. And they built their new mosque right bang slap against the Qasr al-Hajjah. So they reinstated what I said was the traditional urban plan, the Dar al-Imara and mosque configuration, where those two elements are next to each other. But nonetheless, as you can see from the plan, that's still quite an unusual arrangement because they're both then on the edge of the city, which is not exactly where you'd expect them to be. So it's a little bit atypical, but it does restore the Dar al-Imara and mosque configuration. They changed the style of mosques completely. This is an aerial view of the Qutubiyya, and you can see how large the minaret is. These were some of the largest minarets ever built in the Islamic world before modern times. And they also went further with this idea of transforming landscape by founding a huge number of suburban estates, all centered on massive artificial lakes. And you can still see one of those if you go to Marrakesh and you visit the Menara Gardens. And in fact, you have a picture there on the right, that is the Menara Garden. But please ignore the little pavilion, which is 18th, 19th century, not actually Almohad. The image on the other side is one of the only surviving Almohad gates in Marrakesh, the Bab Aghnau. And this dates to the period where the city was further expanded and made grander by Abu Yaqub Yusuf and his son Yaqub al-Mansur. So we have three. We have Abd al-Mu'min, his son and his grandson, all acting on the urban environment and significantly altering it. This part of town was called Marrakesh in some sources. Now this is interesting because that's actually just the feminine form of Marrakesh. If you're in local Berber languages, because female nouns are formed by T and T. So you put a T at the beginning and you put a T at the end. So you'll find a lot of words in Morocco, like placing, tensift. That's the female form of Nafis. So you get these kind of, this TT formation in a lot of place names. So Marrakesh is really just the feminine form of Marrakesh, but it was also known as As-Saliha, the pure or the sound, the righteous. And it was a very grand Palatine area. If I just take you back, that lower green circle encircles what became Marrakesh as-Salihah. More estates were added, but also chronicles begin to talk about specific building types associated with important cities in the east. The hospital, the Maristan. I mean, I understand that from a Persian perspective, Maristan is a rather odd word for a hospital, but that's what they were called. A Caesarea, a lockable royal market. Possibly a madrasa. I put a question mark after that because it's very debatable whether the Almohads did found a madrasa or not in Marrakesh, but some sources think they might have done. So that brings me really more or less to the end. And I just wanted to just sort of sum up some of the Almohad discourses around Marrakesh and this reordering of urban space to reflect a very different ideology from that of the preceding Almoravid regime. First, this idea of writing the deviant Qibla and the idea that the Almoravid, I mean, by the way, the Almoravids chose their Qibla by consulting with 40 Maliki jurists. And it was actually geographically, one might say, more accurate than the Almohad Qibla. But it was denounced by the Almohads as being incorrect and needing alteration. And so this is partly an idea I spoke about to those of you who were in the reading group, that, you know, the Almohads believed they were replaying the original Islamic story, that Ibn Tumar was a new Muhammad as the Mahdi, that these were new times, this was new space. And from their perspective, their base in the High Atlas Mountains, Tin Mal, was a Dar al-Hijra. It was Medina. And from that perspective, Almoravid Marrakesh was Mecca, the city of the pagans or the defective Muslims, which needed reshaping and remodeling and remaking in the same way that Mecca, you know, the shrine wasn't destroyed, it was remodeled, it was remade as something new, the Kaaba and an Islamic shrine. So in the same way, the Almohads want to remake Marrakesh. And this conversation about the deviant Qibla is how they express that, and then the building of the big new Qutubiyya mosque. Secondly, this idea of bringing water to an arid world, which is incipient in what Ali ibn Yusuf had done, but in a Almohad era chronicler, well, he's really a geographer, a historical geographer, Ibn Abdurrabbi, he talks about all the foundations built by the Almohad caliphs, their buildings, you know, their garden estates, their caravanserais, and he completes his passage by saying Marrakesh has more gardens, estates, vines, fruits, and produce than any other town in the Maghreb, where previously a bird flying over the area would die of thirst and intense heat, which really conveys that idea of the transformation. You know, previously it was so arid that a poor bird trying to fly over would just be stunned dead by the heat. And then it had become this beautiful, paradisal, garden-like space as a result of Almohad interventions. He's ignoring Almoravid interventions. So then there's this idea of adding all these new institutions and foundations, which had become popular in the Islamic East, and making Marrakesh an imperial city. And there are other texts which talk very much about Marrakesh as being the capital of the Islamic world, the pivot, the pole, the center, the Dunya, if you like, the center of the world, rather than Eastern Islamic cities. And remember, but by the Almohad period, we talk about the 12th century, this is the Crusades, this is the collapse of centralized power in the Islamic East. And from the Almohad perspective, they were the primary Muslim power of their era. They were the caliphs of the Islamic world in their time. You know, the Seljuks are squabbling, there's Zangids, there's Ayyubids, Salah ad-Din, he asked the Almohad Caliph for a navy. And, we sort of think of him as this big hero and so powerful in the East, but actually, in terms of the Mediterranean dynamics at the time, he sent a begging letter to the Almohad Caliph. So their posturing and their sense of their own power and position was not entirely unfounded in the 12th century. And for me, that's just my plea about thinking about the Maghreb as being part of the Islamic world and very important at certain periods in terms of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and Islamic history. I'm going to very quickly conclude now by saying that, Marrakesh in these 2 centuries is a very interesting case study because it is founded and then modified by 2 very distinctive dynasties with distinctive ideas about their self-identity, distinctive origins, which are not the same as those of regimes in many other parts of the Islamic world in the period. So we have the Almoravids, where they're very strong Maliki Sunni position. The Almohads with their Mahdistic ideology, which was very much at odds with the position of the Almoravids who preceded them. But then in both cases, I'm interested in how they, and perhaps to a greater extent their chroniclers, interact with ideas of Islamic city foundation and Islamic urban imaginary that had developed over centuries, and what points of reference they pick on and what they're interested in talking about. And this is why I find it interesting that you do get these references to transformations of wilderness, which we can also find in foundation myths from the Islamic East, or the idea of the humble ruler as a contrast to the imperial master building his luxurious palaces full of marble, so on and so forth. But then also how Western regimes then do try and incorporate those kind of ideas and more luxurious imperial architecture over time. And we see, lots of these debates, particularly when we look at the Masjid al-Saqaya and how it was replaced and closed and by the Qutubiyya, but how the minbar itself was actually transported from one mosque to another because of the increased importance of an urban imaginary related to the Umayyads of Cordoba, in that case, and Cordoba as this great center of the past, which it made sense to reference. So I think I'll stop there. I hope that's given you a little, like a whistle-stop tour of Marrakesh, a little bit of an insight into how the city developed, and maybe some other ways to think about how we read foundation myths and the evolution of cities as they're narrated in medieval chronicles. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Amira. Before I would close the recording and open the floor for questions, I would have one question, which is quite general, and I would be very interested in your reply. So it's well, we talk about decolonization, we talk about the Middle East, and Hodgson, when he wanted to debunk this, he came up with the idea of Nile to Oxus, and I never understood. So well, talking about the Middle East is already, North Africa is not East, even if from a colonial perspective it is interesting. Then yes, why do you think North Africa and the Maghreb is still kind of colonized, even in the scholarly ways to look at it, and well, perhaps within the Muslim by scholarship as well, and certainly Western European scholarship. As I never understood why to stop at the Nile.
I mean, it may be because a lot of writers of Arabic kind of stopped at the Nile, in a sense. I mean, Maghrebis always went east to perform the pilgrimage. They went to Mecca, and they arrived in Cairo or other incarnations of that city. They went south to the Hijaz. They often went up to Syria. So they were actually quite familiar with those spaces. And you see it, those who claimed Arab ancestry saw it, they saw that as their homeland. And they didn't see themselves as copying or being derivative when they wrote literature which was based on Eastern models, because they saw those Eastern models as part of their own heritage, as migrants quite some time ago from east to west. But the number of Easterners who had come west is much lower in number. And some North Africans see the Arab Islamic conquest itself as colonialism. It's the colonization of the Maghreb, the indigenous peoples of the Maghreb, by armies coming out of the east. And just the fact that we call them Berbers. We've tried to stop calling them Berbers, but Imazigen or Amazigh are not commonly known terms, so it's sometimes difficult not to say Berbers. But it's from Berber, barbarians. It's not exactly complimentary. It's not exactly the term the indigenous population of North Africa chose for themselves. Led on top of that, I think they weren't like the Persians with a well-established literary culture, which could then start to be written in Arabic and could then sort of reassert itself and create a more sort of multivocal or multiliterate space. Although Berber languages were written in Arabic, they weren't written extensively in Arabic. And anyone who wanted to be considered educated in North Africa for a millennium had to write in Arabic. So you find that those who write the history of North Africa are then Arabized indigenous individuals. And there are all these other people who are completely left out of the equation. Question marks about how Muslim the Almoravids are all relate to the fact that they're Saharan nomads and they have certain customs which observers in the Iberian Peninsula, for instance, find a bit odd. But they're Maliki Sunni. They're very orthodox, actually. But yeah, they have customary practices as tribesmen, which are not urban. But I think, it's just sort of layers on layers. And then that was picked up by scholarship. And then, of course, there's just the imperial boundaries in modern times that we all respond to, in the sense that, the Maghreb is very, very well studied in France. Why is that? Oh, it was part of the French Empire. Whereas in the UK, there's much more focus on, Egypt. Oh, yes, we did have a bit of a role in Egypt at one point, or India, or the Middle East. Or yes, we tried to sort of grab Iraqi oil at one point. So, there are all these reasons why particular areas get more studied, and none of us has infinite time, energy, expertise. So once we've sort of settled on something, it's difficult then to go wider and wider and wider. I think I'm the only pre-modern Maghreb specialist in post in the United Kingdom. So there are people who work on the imperial phase, and they've come to it through French often, but many fewer people work on medieval North Africa. I have to nip across to France or Spain to find loads of people doing the same thing. So I think there's lots of reasons, basically.
Wow, thank you very much, Amira. We learned a lot about the specific topic and about large implications, but everyone can apply for their own fields. It's not just about North Africa. Not that North Africa wouldn't be supremely important in itself. Well, thank you. I'm going to close the recording and open the floor for questions. And then don't forget the series will continue from January.